So first off, I would like to take this opportunity to extend our thanks to UTTRI and its members for giving us the opportunity to conduct this very interesting study. I'm going to, this is the outline of our presentation today. So I'm going to give the presentation on behalf of the team, but during the Q&A period, all of us, my colleagues, Dr. Kasrayan and Dr. Diab, will be joining me in answering and addressing any comments. So the outline of our presentation today is I'm going very quickly to go over the project goal and tasks that we conducted. And then I'll spend some time on the literature review. We performed a survey of Canadian agencies with respect to the ridership prediction practice. And the focus really of the presentation will be on the modeling of ridership trends and patterns across Canada. And finally, I'll be talking about an analytical tool, actually a set of tools, two tools that we developed based on the model to facilitate any policy analysis. So the goal of the project was essentially, and I'm quoting from the terms of reference that were given to us by UTTRI, was to conduct an in-depth study on both current and future conventional ridership trends across the country through research and consultation with transit systems in order to provide a better understanding of the correlation and relationship between causal factors and ridership in Canada. So the main objective really of this study was to enhance our understanding of the ridership patterns and trends that we see across Canada and the underlying factors that give rise to those variations. So in order to meet this goal, the study consisted of 5 major tasks. The first was to consult with the literature, both the academic literature as well as the public reports by different research centers and government agencies. So we conducted a fairly detailed literature review with the aim of understanding the emerging ridership trends in Canada and elsewhere. Also gain a better understanding of the potential causal factors that affect ridership trends and patterns, and also improve our understanding of the different modeling methods and prediction methods that were used in other contexts to model ridership trends. The second major task of this study was to perform, to essentially consult with the Canadian transit agencies. And we did this through a web-based survey. So we designed the survey, we reached out with the help of UTTRI to all its members, and we got a representative sample, which enabled us to understand the practices of different transit agencies with respect to ridership prediction, and also their needs and aspirations with respect to ridership analysis. Then we embarked on an effort to collect very detailed time series data on various potential factors that are potentially correlated with ridership. And we've done this for all transit agencies across Canada, so it was a major undertaking. And we used this data in the next task to develop robust models of ridership prediction as a function of different variables, factors. And that was really the main deliverable or the key deliverable of this study, those models that enabled us to gain better understanding of the factors that really explain the variation among different transit agencies and also across time. And then the final task was to convert those models into spreadsheet tools, practical analytical tools that can be turned over to transit agencies to use those models for policy analysis. So the project was a very fast-paced project. It actually spanned about 4 months. We've done all those tasks within 4 months through a dedicated team here on our side. The project started in late January and ended in the first week of June. And throughout the process, there was a very interactive back and forth between our team and the steering committee. We received a lot of guidance, received a lot of insights throughout the process from the steering committee. And again, I take this opportunity to thank them dearly for their input. Okay, so I'm going to go over each one of the tasks to summarize our findings. So the literature review, as I mentioned, we consulted the literature. We essentially reviewed 28 recent papers that also looked at the same issue of ridership variations across systems and also ridership trends over time. And we also reviewed 14 reports that were produced and published by different agencies, including CUTA, APTA, TCRP, and various transportation research centers and agencies across North America. So the scope of the review of this literature, it actually spanned different levels of spatial aggregation. So there were studies that looked at only trends within a single city, whereas some other studies that looked at multiple cities, trends across different multiple cities. Some studies that looked at only cross-sectional variations. In other words, they didn't really look at variations over time, whereas other studies looked at longitudinal and temporal variations across, over time. And we've also seen a variety of modeling methods that were used by different studies. Some of them used simple regression models, others used more sophisticated models. And also what was of notice was the wide range of factors that were explored in those different studies. And we categorized those factors broadly into 4 classes. The first are variables that have to do with the built environment. And the second class was of socio-economic characteristics, and then transit service characteristics, and other external and contextual characteristics. I'm going to shed more light and provide more details about each one of those. But generally, the literature showed us that there's a wide range of factors that were explored in other studies. Some studies focus on 1 or 2 factors only, while others explored different ones. The lessons that we actually learned from reviewing the literature were the following points. The first was that there's a need for considering both variability and variation temporally, in addition to the spatial variations or variations between different lines or between different systems. Most studies focus on spatial variations. If it's a single city study, so they would look at spatial variation and ridership among different lines. Studies that looked at multiple cities, they would look at variability among the different transit systems, but not really temporally at the same time. Very, very few studies that looked at temporal variation and temporal trends over time, but they wouldn't actually consider simultaneously the spatial variation. So there was actually a clear need to consider both variation across space and over time, and that's something that we did in our study. The second lesson that we learned was the issue of the simultaneity between supply and demand. As we all know, transit demand is affected by supply, and also supply is affected by demand. So transit agencies respond to any surge or increase in demand or any change in demand by changing also the supply. So there's this simultaneous relationship, two-way relationship between supply and demand that also needs to be captured very well in the modeling system. Again, in most previous studies, they looked mostly at really the demand as a function of supply. So in our study, we made a conscious effort to really try to capture this simultaneous relationship between the supply and demand. And I'm going to elaborate on this later on. The third lesson was really to investigate a wide range of variables, not focusing on one or two or very few factors, but incorporate as many variables as possible so that we make sure that we are not really missing something. But of course, paying attention to the issue of collinearity, because you can include multiple independent variables that might actually be correlated with one another, which might cause some bias and some issues with the model itself, resulting perhaps in counterintuitive signs or whatnot. So those are the key lessons that we learned from the literature review. The second task, as I mentioned before, was the consultation with the Canadian transit agencies to gain a better understanding of the ridership data and ridership prediction practices and so on and so forth. So we designed a web-based survey, and with the help of UTTRI, we distributed the survey to all its members in the months of February and March earlier this year. There are more details about the survey and the report, which you can look at your leisure. But the survey consisted mainly of 5 sections. The first section inquired about the cases in which transit agencies used ridership modeling and ridership prediction. The second section included questions about the data sources that the transit agencies rely upon to get their ridership data. And also some questions about really the quality of those data sources. The third section included questions about, what kind of methods transit agencies use when they model or try to predict ridership in the future. And the fourth section was about the different variables and inputs that they use in those prediction models, and how satisfied they are with those kind of prediction methods. And we asked a few other questions about what they think really of a good ridership model would look like and what their aspirations are. So we got actually a very good response. Well, initially the response was a little bit weak, but with some extra efforts, we managed to get about 36 responses from across the country. And you see in front of you a map of the different agencies that responded to us, which thankfully we really have representatives from each and every province. And we have small and big systems and so on. So we have a reasonably representative sample with about 35% response rate. So the key findings of the survey was, not surprisingly, that the majority of transit agencies do not necessarily have formal guidelines for ridership prediction. In other words, that they embark on ridership prediction on an ad hoc basis, on a case-by-case basis. Whenever ridership models are used, they are used, simple methods are used, qualitative and judgment-based methods are used, like elasticity-based methods, for example, or trendline analysis, and more sophisticated 4-stage models were used for large-scale investment or the assessment and planning of large-scale investments. And whenever those are used, those were mainly used by big transit agencies that use more sophisticated methods. And of course, this is like on the aggregate. There might be cases where smaller agencies that use sophisticated methods, but on the aggregate, those were the results. And the most common factors that we found transit agencies use whenever they estimate quantitative models, again, in those 4 categories in the built environment, population has been used as a determinant of ridership. Also some street network factors. With respect to socioeconomic factors, student population was used as a determinant and an explanatory factor, as well as workforce statistics, and also household factors such as income. With respect to internal factors or transit-related factors, transit fares, service frequency, and other factors have been used as also independent variables in ridership prediction models. And in the last category, external factors such as weather, congestion level, road congestion level, car ownership levels, and so on, were also used as explanatory variables of ridership in ridership models. We also asked the agencies about initiatives that they have used to or introduced to increase transit ridership. So the more common were like introducing new LRT lines or major scheduling or network adjustments, and also introduction of UPass, the Universal Post-Secondary Pass, Transit Pass. Transit agencies have actually complained about the accuracy of data. This is a major issue that was expressed by many transit agencies, that sometimes the ridership data is not really highly accurate. So that was a concern to them with respect to using this kind of data for ridership models. And also, in terms of requirements that they would like to see in a ridership model, that the main really requirement is really to have high quality input data and simplified models, not really very complex models that really nobody understands. So that was really expressed by many transit agencies as really something to be taken into consideration while developing models, that models really should be based on highly reliable data, and that those models should be simple enough to be to understand. And those are things that we took into consideration when we built our models. So the next task for us was to use the input or use the lessons learned from both the literature review and the survey, the agency survey, into the next task, which is to model ridership trends across Canada. So the objective of this task, as mentioned before, was to perform an empirical investigation of the different variables and factors that explain the variation in transit ridership among transit systems and over time. So again, we actually want to be able to capture the variation between different transit systems and also over time. So to do that, we embarked on a major effort to collect data. So as I said, this was built or was really based on the literature review and the survey results. So we compiled an extensive list of potential spatiotemporal factors from different sources. So from UTTRI was very generous to give us a lot of agency data. But also we got data from the census and different sources. And those variables or factors were categorized in the 4 classes that I mentioned before: built environment attributes, socioeconomic characteristics, transit service characteristics, and other external and contextual characteristics. In total, we gathered data on 80 variables in those 4 categories that I mentioned, for 103 transit agencies across the country. So for each transit agency, we had information about 80 variables for about 15 years, from 1991 to 2016. So you can imagine it was a very massive database that we developed. But of course, due to some data limitations, we were only able to use data from 2002 to 2016 due to a variety of reasons. But still, that was a very extensive data set that we used in the next step to develop our models. So, and one also point to note is that we transformed our all our variables into the natural logarithm form for a couple of reasons. One is to facilitate really the interpretation of the coefficients of those variables in the models, so that we can really assess very quickly the elasticity of those factors with or elasticity of transit demand with respect to those factors. The other reason for doing this, for computing the natural logarithm, is really to address the skewness of some of the variables. And we're not alone, or we're not the first really to do this. Many other studies have also modeled ridership in the logarithm form as opposed to the original form. So our methodology, we developed some descriptive statistics and also did a very basic and descriptive ridership trends analysis. I'm going to show a few examples here, but there are a lot more results can be found in the model and the report, I mean. And but the crux really of the work was to develop the 3 statistical models. If the first model was a national model, a general model for all transit agencies in Canada, and then we divided really the data set into big or large large agencies and small agencies, and we developed a model for each one of those. The threshold that we used for large agency is 1.2 million linked trips per year. Of course, you may argue this is not really really a good definition, but this was really the median, the 50th percentile of the data that we had. We couldn't really go smaller than that because, or else really the sample would be very small, would not be statistically significant. So, you know, the definition here of large agency versus small agency, you just need to bear this point in mind as we discuss the results later on. The third step was to do model validation, and I'll speak to this later on. So the key requirements guiding the model development, again, from the lessons learned in the literature review, as well as the feedback we received from the transit agencies, was to control for the longitudinal nature of the data. So because each transit agency in our sample had 15 observations from 2002 to 2016, and for each one of those years it had like 80 variables. So one requirement was really to control for the longitudinal nature of the data. The second requirement was to measure both types of variation, variation between different transit agencies, and also variation across time or over time. So to be able to measure both types of variation. And the third requirement was to account for the simultaneity or the two-way relationship that I talked about before between transit service supply and demand. So to do this, we developed a so-called two-stage least squares models with the instrumental variables along with so-called random effects estimator. So the random effects estimator helps us to control for this longitudinal or panel structure of the data, because, as I mentioned, each transit agency has 15 observations. So we structured the data, or we designed the data set in a panel structure, and we applied a random effects estimator to take into effect or to control really and account for this panel structure. And to address the issue of simultaneity between supply and demand, we developed this two-stage least squares model, and I'm going to elaborate on this right now. So we essentially developed two models. The first model is the supply model, which is revenue hours as a function of so-called exogenous variables, and those exogenous variables were the population and the operating budget. So in other words, we actually were estimating the revenue hours, which is a measure of supply, as a function of the population of the service area and the operating budget of the transit agency. Okay, so it's not really function of demand directly. And then we use that variable, the revenue hours, as an independent variable in the second model. So the second model is the demand model, which really predicts the number of linked trips, for an agency as a function of the revenue hours, the built environment factors, socio-economic factors, transit service factors, and other factors. So this structure here takes care of this issue of simultaneous supply and demand. And so before I share with you the results, the detailed results of the models, I'm just going to show you very quickly some trend line analysis. Just a few examples, but there are more of those in the report. So the trend that I'm sure we are all familiar with of ridership from 1991 to 2016, that we've seen some growth, but in recent years, over the past 5 years or so, we've seen some plateauing and some leveling off of ridership trends. And this is, of course, across the country. So as of 2016, we have a little bit above 2 billion linked trips across the country every year. And as we expect, this is those are the trend lines by provinces, the 4 biggest provinces. The top one is Ontario, the second one is BC, is Quebec, and then BC, and then Alberta. So similar trends that, you know, in last 5 years or so, we see leveling off of those trends. We are not seeing any growth. Of course, those are across all agencies in each one of those provinces. So those are aggregate numbers. We looked at a number of factors, and we contrasted the trends on those factors with the ridership trends. So the first one we looked at is the service area population. So those orange or yellow trend line is the population from 1991 to 2016. And superimposed on the ridership trends. So we see more or less some association and correspondence between the two to some extent. So the higher the population, the more ridership growth over the years, and so on. With respect to vehicle revenue hours, also some association between the two, between ridership and vehicle revenue hours. The upward trends, for example, in ridership is also associated with upward trends in vehicle revenue hours. Again, bear in mind the two-way relationship between the two. One more example that I'm showing here is the gas prices. So over the past few years prior to 2016, there has been a decline in gas prices across the country, but we didn't really see a corresponding decline in ridership. So this suggests that transit ridership is sort of inelastic with respect to gas prices. I mean, the cross elasticity is a little bit weak, and this also is consistent with the other studies that we've seen in the literature, that people actually, before they change their behavior due to gas prices, they probably resort to other things. Now I'm going to get into the details of the models. And before I say that, again, the few slides that I've shown you, there are more of them in the report, but also you have to be a little bit careful. Those are visual assessments, and they are not necessarily controlling for other factors that might be affecting some of those trends. So the models really are better tools to really account for the different factors and the controlling for the effect of individual factors. So as I mentioned, our models really are two-stage models. The first stage is the supply model. It estimates the vehicle revenue hours as a function of total population and total operating budget. So we see here that the models first have very high R squared of 0.973. So a lot of the variation across time and across transit systems is well captured by this model. And the two independent variables that we looked at, the total population and the operating budget, they are both statistically significant. Because we are using the logarithm form, so the interpretation here of this, that a 10% increase in operating budget would result in 5.5% increase in ridership. And also similarly, a 10% increase in total population would result in a 4.7% increase in ridership. So, and those variables were shown to be significant at even the 99%. So sorry, I'm sorry. My colleague here corrected me. So this is a supply model. So it's revenue hours as a function of operating budget and total population. So again, a 10% increase in operating budget would result in a 5.5% increase in operating in revenue hours, and a 10% increase in population would result in 4.7% increase in revenue hours. The second stage model, which this is the final model, of course, there were so many iterations and so many attempts, but this is the final model that you see in front of you here. So again, to remind you, this is a model of the ridership at the agency level as a function of a number of factors. The first one is the predicted revenue hours, and then a host of other factors from the built environment, socio-economic factors, internal factors, and external factors. So I'm going to discuss some of those results here. So the supply variable, which is the vehicle revenue hours, which we predicted in the previous model that I showed you in the previous slide, has been shown to be statistically significant and has a very high coefficient value. So again, to interpret this value here of the coefficient for the national level is that a 10% increase in vehicle revenue hours, we see more than 10% of increase in ridership. So again, it's an indication of, the more supply, the more service that we provide, there's an associated ridership increase that we see with that increase in revenue hours. With respect to the built environment factors, so we've seen a high or a positive association between ridership and the percentage of apartment dwellings. So service areas that have higher percentage of apartment dwellings, they have higher ridership, and again, this is an indication of higher density, and which we all know that will result in higher ridership. It creates a more conducive environment for higher ridership. So, and the model tells us here at the national level that 10% increase in percent of apartment dwellings would result in about 5% increase in ridership. And at the same time, also an increase in the percentage of row house dwellings would result in a positive ridership increase. And on the contrary, as service areas that have higher percentages of single-family dwellings have lower ridership, all else being equal, of course. And the number of local opportunities, which represents really the mixed use nature of the urban form, the higher the mixed use it is, the higher ridership would be expected to be, all else being equal. Similarly, some socioeconomic factors like population, percent of population seniors, it was shown in large agency models, the higher the percentage of population seniors, of seniors in the population, the higher the transit ridership. Many of those would use transit. Also interestingly, the percent of population of the population who are recent immigrants, we found that in smaller agency model, that this factor was significant. So the higher the percentage of immigrants in the population in the service area, we would expect to see higher ridership, all else being equal. Some internal factors, I'll focus on the personal expenditure on public transit, which is a proxy for fares. So the higher the fares, the lower the ridership would be expected, all else being equal. And this is valid across both models and nationally as well. Gas prices has been shown, especially for large agencies, the higher the gas prices, we would expect to see higher transit ridership. We also looked at automated fare collection systems, so agencies that rely on automated fare collection, smart card systems as a source for ridership data. And this is something we wanted to actually test whether, in fact, systems that rely on other ridership data sources, do we see any difference with respect to ridership trends? And we've seen a statistically significant factor here, that those agencies that rely on smart card systems as a source for the ridership data to have a lower ridership, all else being equal. So this might actually be speaking to the quality and reliability of those systems as a source of ridership data. One interesting variable that we actually wanted to look at is also the presence of Uber, because as you remember, this is a temporal study as well. So we have for each agency the ridership data and the data on all the independent variables between 2002 and 2016. So we added a dummy variable that really marks the year in which Uber was entered in each and every one of those agencies. And we tested this dummy variable, and we found some interesting results here. So for large agencies, this dummy variable was shown to be positive. In other words, that when Uber was introduced, there was an increase in ridership, all else being equal. Whereas for smaller agencies, this dummy variable was shown to be negative. In other words, that when Uber was introduced in those localities, we've seen a reduction in ridership, all else being equal, which is an interesting result, perhaps speaking about the complementarity of Uber, maybe perhaps being used as a first mile, last mile method to access public transit, whereas in smaller agencies, it might actually be used as a substitution of transit, especially in areas which are not very well served by public transit. But again, this is not really an in-depth study of the effect of ride-sharing services, so you have to take those results with a little bit of a grain of salt. We also looked at the presence of bike-sharing systems, and we've seen on the aggregate that wherever whenever and wherever those systems were introduced, we've seen slight reduction in ridership, all else being equal. The model actually was shown to have a very high R-square, again, above 0.9, again, indicating that the variability across transit system and over time has been well captured by the model. Also, we went into the extra step of validating the model. So the results that you've seen in the previous slides were actually based on a training sample, which is 90% of the data that we collected. We reserved, or we put aside 10% of the data as a validation sample. So we built the model using the 90% of data, and then we used the model to predict really the outcome on the validation sample, and we compared the two, like the outcome of the model of the validation sample versus the actual ridership. What we've seen, that we were pleased to see very good results, that really there's very good association between the predicted and the actual number of trips on the validation sample. So this gives us more confidence and more trust in the model that we developed. And the Pearson correlation coefficient between the predicted and the actual on the validation sample was greater than 0.9. Again, something to give us more trust and more confidence really in the results of the model. And also, this is a plot really of the actual versus the predicted on the validation sample, again showing a very high association here. So to conclude the findings of our study and also share some insights about the policy implications. So transit ridership in Canada, and this is again to remind you, this is not really a study of one or two agencies, but really it's across the country. So it really represents the aggregate behavior of agencies across the country and not necessarily of one or two agencies. So you have to bear this in mind as we interpret the results. So in general, transit ridership in Canada is associated and related to a number of factors, and those relationships really vary according to the transit agency size. So which really indicates that one size fits all policies are not recommended. Whatever works for a big agency might not actually work for a small agency. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. Our study showed us that the internal transit service factors, specifically the revenue vehicle hours and the personal expenditure on transit as a proxy for fares, are key drivers of ridership across all transit agencies. So there is very high association between ridership and revenue vehicle hours as a measure of supply, and also with the personal expenditure on transit. So which really means that investing in public transit more, of course, we're not talking about the details here. We know what kind of transit network structure and so on. We're not talking about that here. But generally speaking, investing in public transit so that we can increase the supply should help improve and increase the demand. And also finding ways of reducing the cost of public transit by perhaps introducing some co-fare or integrated fare schemes, so that should help maintain or better yet improve transit ridership. The model also showed us that the built environment factors, they play a strong and important role with respect to transit ridership. So policies that influence the built environment, and essentially to try to densify the urban form by increasing the percentage of apartments and row housing, and reduce the percentage of single-family dwellings, those should improve transit ridership. Again, that's not something that's all too surprising. I think we've known that from before. The model confirms those relationships across the country. Also, socioeconomic factors have been shown to play a significant role with respect to transit ridership. So percent of secondary students, so post-secondary students are a major source of transit ridership in many agencies, as well as seniors and recent immigrants. So our model showed us that those socioeconomic groups, they play a major role in maintaining or increasing our transit ridership. So again, policies related to those socioeconomic groups, making transit really more affordable to them and more accessible to them would definitely help improve transit ridership. And as I noted a few minutes earlier, that ride-sharing services have a mixed impact on ridership, according to our model. So with respect to the size of the transit system, so the model shows that ride-sharing services possibly is playing more integrative and complementary role in big cities, whereas it's might be actually now playing a more substitutional or competing role with transit. So policies that really ensure integration both for big systems and small systems are obviously are in order and would be recommended. So we converted, as I mentioned, the models into analytical tools, spreadsheet tools for ease of use by transit agencies. So we developed essentially 3 analytical tools, and the main objective is to facilitate and make it simpler for transit agencies to analyze the effect of individual factors or policies on ridership, while keeping all other variables constant at their mean values. So the benefits of those spreadsheet tools are that they can really help us. They can serve as a practical instrument to estimate the relative changes in ridership due to changes in different factors. So if we have 2 alternative solution or strategies or policies, one could really test the resulting change in or the expected change in ridership of each one of those policies, either individually or in combination. So as concluding remarks, so this study represents, compared to other studies in the literature, is a very comprehensive investigation of both spatio-temporal variability in ridership across Canada, using data from all transit agencies across the country, while incorporating a very wide range of factors, not focusing on 1 or 2 classes, but actually 4 classes of variables that were tested here. And this is a table that really shows or contrasts our study to previous recent studies with respect to the methods used and also the variables that were used and so on. I think it's a study that helped us gain more insights and understanding about the variability and variation across the country and also over time. So with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you